You're standing in the shadow of the Colosseum at dawn, watching as gladiators emerge from underground chambers that most Romans never see. The morning air carries the metallic scent of blood mixed with something else: expensive perfumes, exotic oils, and the unmistakable musk of bodies pressed together in ways that would scandalize even the most jaded Roman citizen. These aren't just warriors preparing for death in the arena. They're participants in the most forbidden pleasures of the ancient world, serving desires so twisted that history has tried to bury them beneath centuries of marble and myth. What you're about to discover isn't found in your history textbooks. It's hidden in fragments of papyrus, whispered accounts from terrified servants, and archaeological evidence that scholars have spent decades trying to explain away. The gladiators of Caligula's reign weren't just entertainers. They were the centerpiece of sexual rituals so extreme, so systematically organized, that they make modern scandals look like children's games. Before diving into these forbidden stories of power and exploitation, if you enjoy uncovering the darkest secrets of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient mysteries together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the shadows behind civilization's greatest monuments. The man who orchestrated these underground gatherings was no ordinary emperor. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, ascended to power in 37 AD at just 24 years old, inheriting an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt. Romans initially celebrated his rise, hoping this young, charismatic leader would restore the glory of his great-great-grandfather Julius Caesar. They had no idea they were welcoming a monster whose appetites would consume everything in their path. Caligula's transformation from beloved prince to depraved tyrant didn't happen overnight. It began with a fever in 38 AD that nearly killed him. When he recovered, those closest to him noticed disturbing changes. The charming young man who had won hearts with his generosity and wit now displayed a cold calculation that chilled even hardened senators. But it was his growing obsession with the gladiatorial games that revealed the true depths of his corruption. Where previous emperors had used gladiatorial contests as political theater, bread and circuses to placate the masses, Caligula saw something else entirely. He recognized these warriors as the perfect instruments for his most private desires. These men existed outside normal Roman society, neither slave nor citizen, living in a liminal space where conventional morality held no sway. They were property that could fight, objects that could bleed, and most importantly, for Caligula's purposes, bodies that could be used in ways that would destroy any respectable Roman's reputation. The emperor began visiting the gladiatorial schools with unusual frequency, claiming to study fighting techniques and weapon mastery. But servants whispered about what really happened during these private inspections. Caligula would spend hours examining the fighters, testing their reflexes, measuring their endurance, and evaluating them according to criteria that had nothing to do with their skill in combat. These evaluations took place in chambers beneath the training grounds, spaces that had been quietly modified under imperial orders. What had once been simple storage areas were transformed into elaborate suites, decorated with silk hangings, golden fixtures, and furniture designed for purposes that no architect would include in official plans. The renovations were completed by craftsmen who were immediately transferred to distant provinces, or who simply disappeared from historical records entirely. The first hints of what transpired in these hidden chambers emerged from the diary of Marcus Flavius, a young senator whose family connections had earned him a position in Caligula's inner circle. Flavius initially felt honored by the emperor's attention, believing his inclusion in private gatherings would advance his political career. His early entries describe elaborate dinner parties where the finest food and wine were served, while gladiators provided entertainment that gradually became more intimate and disturbing. The emperor speaks of these men as if they were exotic animals. Flavius wrote in an entry that would later be hidden in his family's archives for nearly 2,000 years. He discusses their bodies with the clinical detachment of a physician, but his eyes burn with a hunger that makes my stomach turn. When he touches them, and he touches them constantly, examining muscles, testing reflexes. There's something predatory in his manner that the gladiators clearly recognize and fear. What Flavius documented in those private writings was the systematic transformation of Rome's most celebrated warriors into instruments of imperial pleasure. Caligula had discovered that the same physical conditioning that made these men deadly in the arena also made them ideal for more private forms of entertainment. Their strength, endurance, and trained obedience to authority created the perfect combination for the emperor's increasingly elaborate fantasies. The selection process for these private gatherings was both methodical and deeply disturbing. Caligula would personally review new gladiators, evaluating them not just for fighting ability, but for physical characteristics that served his hidden purposes. Height, build, facial features, even the sound of their voices. Everything was cataloged and compared against the emperor's evolving preferences. Those chosen for special service were moved to separate quarters within the gladiatorial schools, facilities that had been extensively modified to accommodate the emperor's requirements. These spaces included chambers designed for specific activities, equipped with restraints, exotic furniture, and collections of implements that served purposes having nothing to do with combat training. The psychological conditioning of these selected gladiators was as systematic as their physical preparation. They were taught new forms of obedience that went far beyond the battlefield submission required in the arena. They learned to anticipate the emperor's moods, to position themselves for inspection, and to endure experiences that would have broken free citizens. This training was conducted by specialized instructors, former gladiators who had earned their freedom through service to previous emperors, and who understood exactly what would be required of the new recruits. But Caligula's ambitions extended beyond individual encounters with selected warriors. He began organizing gatherings that combined multiple gladiators with carefully chosen guests from Rome's elite families. These events, held in the modified chambers beneath the training grounds, represented a new form of entertainment that blended the violence of the arena with pleasures so extreme they existed at the very boundaries of human experience. The guest list for these gatherings read like a directory of Roman power. Senators, wealthy merchants, military commanders, and foreign dignitaries who had been invited to witness the emperor's private spectacles. Many attended out of curiosity, others from political necessity, and some because they shared Caligula's appetites. But all left changed by what they had witnessed, bound together by shared secrets that could destroy careers and end lives if revealed. Contemporary accounts describe events that began with elaborate feasts served in the underground chambers. Guests reclined on couches arranged around a central space, where gladiators would initially provide traditional entertainment. Demonstrations of weapon skills, mock combat, displays of strength and agility. But as wine flowed and inhibitions dissolved, the nature of the entertainment gradually shifted into territory that no respectable Roman would acknowledge in daylight. The transformation was carefully orchestrated, with each stage planned to draw guests deeper into complicity while making retreat increasingly difficult. What started as appreciation for athletic prowess evolved into more intimate interactions, with gladiators encouraged to mingle with guests in ways that blurred the boundaries between entertainment and participation. Caligula himself served as both host and director of these proceedings, moving among his guests to encourage their involvement while ensuring that everyone present became implicated in what was unfolding. His genius lay in understanding that shared transgression created unbreakable bonds of loyalty, or at least mutual assured destruction that served the same purpose. The gladiators chosen for these events underwent specialized preparation that went far beyond their normal training regimen. They were bathed in expensive oils adorned with jewelry and silk, and trained in forms of service that had nothing to do with combat. Some were taught to play musical instruments, others to dance, and many to engage in activities that would have been considered deeply shameful for any Roman citizen. This preparation took place over weeks or months, transforming hardened warriors into something entirely different. Living sculptures designed to fulfill the emperor's vision of perfect entertainment. The psychological impact on these men was devastating, as they found themselves caught between their identity as fighters and their new role as objects of imperial pleasure. The chambers themselves were designed to facilitate every aspect of these gatherings, with specialized furniture, lighting systems, and acoustic features that enhance the experience for participants while maintaining absolute secrecy. Hidden passages allowed servants to provide refreshments and supplies without interrupting the proceedings, while concealed observation areas permitted the emperor to monitor activities from multiple vantages. But perhaps most disturbing was the systematic documentation of these events. Caligula ordered artists to create detailed records of the gatherings, not crude sketches, but elaborate paintings and sculptures that captured specific moments and interactions. These artistic works served multiple purposes. They preserved memories of particularly successful events, provided inspiration for future gatherings, and, most importantly, created permanent evidence of each guest's participation that could be used for political leverage. The creation of this artistic archive required the involvement of Rome's most skilled craftsmen, who found themselves commissioned to produce works depicting scenes that challenged every convention of their training. Painters accustomed to creating heroic battle scenes or noble portraits were asked to document activities that existed at the intersection of violence, sexuality, and power in ways that had never been attempted in Roman art. These artists, like the gladiators themselves, became prisoners of the emperor's vision, bound by oath and threat to never reveal what they had witnessed or created. Many were housed within the imperial palace complex, living in comfortable captivity while producing a secret collection that grew larger and more elaborate with each passing month. As Caligula's confidence in his private entertainment system grew, so did the scope and frequency of the gatherings. What had begun as occasional indulgences evolved into regular events that drew participants from across the empire. Foreign dignitaries, visiting merchants, and ambitious provincials all found themselves invited to witness spectacles that defied description while cementing their loyalty to the emperor through shared complicity. The logistics of maintaining this elaborate system required the coordination of hundreds of people: gladiators, servants, guards, artists, and administrators who all played essential roles in keeping the emperor's secrets. Each person involved represented a potential security risk, requiring constant surveillance and regular reminders of the consequences of betrayal. The underground chambers buzzed with activity as this hidden world operated parallel to the official functions of imperial government. But maintaining such an extensive network of secrecy created its own vulnerabilities. The more people involved, the greater the chance that someone would speak, write, or act in ways that might expose the truth. Caligula's solution was characteristically brutal: a system of mutual surveillance where participants were encouraged to report on each other's loyalty, while understanding that their own survival depended on the group's continued silence. This atmosphere of paranoia and mutual dependence created bonds between participants that transcended normal social hierarchies. Senators found themselves allied with gladiators, artists collaborated with administrators, and servants wielded influence over their supposed superiors. The emperor's private world had created its own social order, governed by rules that existed nowhere else in Roman society. The gladiators at the center of this system occupied a unique position that was simultaneously privileged and precarious. They enjoyed luxuries and attentions that exceeded those of many free citizens, but they did so as property whose value depended entirely on their ability to satisfy the emperor's evolving desires. Their training expanded to include skills that no traditional gladiator would recognize, while their daily lives became exercises in anticipating and fulfilling requirements that changed without warning or explanation. The physical demands placed on these selected gladiators went far beyond anything required in traditional arena combat. Where normal fighters trained for brief, intense battles that might last minutes, these men were conditioned for endurance that could stretch through entire nights. Their diet was carefully regulated not just for strength and agility, but to enhance their appearance and stamina according to the emperor's specifications. Special physicians were brought in to monitor their health and physical condition, ensuring they could withstand the rigors of their expanded duties while maintaining the muscular definition that made them valuable. These medical examinations were thorough and invasive, with doctors documenting every aspect of their subject's anatomy in reports that were filed away in imperial archives alongside military intelligence and state secrets. The training facilities themselves were expanded to include areas that bore no resemblance to traditional gladiatorial schools. New chambers were constructed with features that served purposes having nothing to do with weapon practice or combat preparation. These spaces included elaborate bathing facilities where selected fighters would spend hours each day in preparation rituals that transformed them from warriors into living artwork. Temperature-controlled pools filled with oils and perfumes became as important as the traditional sand pits where gladiators had once practiced their deadly craft. The men learned to move differently, to hold themselves according to new standards that emphasized grace and presentation over the functional efficiency that had once defined their training. But it wasn't just their bodies that underwent transformation. The psychological conditioning required to function in Caligula's private world demanded a complete restructuring of these men's understanding of their own identity and purpose. They had to learn to exist simultaneously as feared killers who could dismember opponents in the arena, and as compliant objects who could satisfy the emperor's most intimate requirements without question or resistance. This dual existence created a psychological strain that many couldn't endure. Some gladiators simply broke under the pressure, becoming hollow shells who went through the motions of their duties, while their minds retreated to places where the contradictions couldn't reach them. Others developed a kind of dissociative ability that allowed them to compartmentalize their different roles, switching between personas as circumstances required. The emperor seemed to understand and even encourage this psychological flexibility, viewing it as evidence of superior conditioning rather than trauma response. He would often comment on how well certain gladiators adapted to different requirements, praising their versatility in ways that revealed his complete inability to recognize their humanity. The selection criteria for guests at these private gatherings evolved as Caligula's confidence grew. Initially, he had chosen participants based on political necessity: powerful senators who needed to be compromised, wealthy merchants whose loyalty required securing, foreign dignitaries who could be controlled through shared secrets. But gradually, the emperor began selecting people based on more personal criteria that reflected his developing tastes and interests. Young aristocrats found themselves invited not because of their political importance, but because of their appearance or their reputation for particular appetites. Beautiful wives of powerful men received mysterious invitations that their husbands dared not refuse. Even children from prominent families began appearing on guest lists, their presence justified by claims of cultural education or political introduction that fooled no one who understood the true nature of these gatherings. The chambers where these events took place grew more elaborate with each passing month. What had begun as simple modifications to existing spaces evolved into architectural marvels that pushed the boundaries of Roman engineering. Hidden mechanisms allowed furniture to be reconfigured instantly, creating different environments for different types of entertainment. Lighting systems provided precise control over ambiance, while ventilation networks ensured that sounds and scents remained contained within the designated areas. The artistic documentation of these events became increasingly sophisticated as well. Caligula commissioned not just paintings and sculptures, but elaborate tapestries that could be hung to transform chamber walls into immersive environments. Skilled craftsmen created furniture that served as both functional equipment and artistic statements, each piece designed to facilitate specific activities while maintaining aesthetic beauty. These artistic works were stored in specially constructed vaults beneath the imperial palace, creating a secret museum that contained the most explicit and disturbing collection of art ever assembled in the ancient world. Access to these vaults was restricted to the emperor himself and a handful of trusted servants who maintained the collection, and occasionally retrieved specific pieces for use during gatherings. The gladiators who survived long enough in this system began to develop their own informal hierarchy based not on fighting prowess, but on their ability to anticipate and satisfy the emperor's desires. Those who demonstrated particular skill or enthusiasm in their expanded roles found themselves elevated to positions of relative privilege within the underground community. These favored individuals were given better quarters, finer clothing, and additional training that prepared them for even more specialized roles. Some became trusted assistants who helped prepare newer gladiators for their duties, while others served as intermediaries between the emperor and the broader group of fighters. A few achieved such distinction that they were granted limited freedom of movement within the palace complex, though always under careful surveillance. But privilege in this world came with its own dangers. The more valuable a gladiator became to the emperor's entertainment system, the more difficult it became for him to imagine any existence outside it. These men found themselves trapped not just by physical constraints, but by psychological dependence on a lifestyle that had become their entire reality. The emperor encouraged this dependence by ensuring that his favored gladiators lost all connection to their previous lives. Families were relocated or simply disappeared. Former friends and associates were forbidden from contact. Even memories of life before the imperial service were systematically undermined through a combination of luxury, isolation, and subtle psychological manipulation that left these men unable to conceive of alternatives to their current existence. Meanwhile, the broader gladiatorial community within Rome began to change in response to Caligula's demands. Trainers started selecting and conditioning fighters with an eye toward imperial preferences rather than just arena performance. The traditional gladiatorial schools found themselves competing not just to produce skilled warriors, but to create men who might catch the emperor's attention for more private service. This shift created tensions within the gladiatorial world that had never existed before. Established fighters who had built reputations based on combat skill found themselves overshadowed by younger men whose primary qualifications had nothing to do with their ability to fight. Training methods evolved to emphasize attributes that would appeal to imperial tastes, sometimes at the expense of the martial skills that had traditionally defined gladiatorial excellence. The arena performances themselves began to reflect these changing priorities. Caligula would attend the games with new intensity, using public contests as opportunities to evaluate potential candidates for his private entertainments. His reactions during fights were studied by gladiatorial trainers who learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated imperial interest in particular fighters. Those gladiators who caught the emperor's attention during the public performances often found their lives transformed overnight. They would be summoned to private audiences where their suitability for expanded service was evaluated according to criteria that remained mysterious to everyone except Caligula himself. Some returned to their normal duties unchanged, while others disappeared into the imperial system, never to be seen in the public arena again. The financial costs of maintaining this elaborate entertainment system were enormous, requiring resources that would have funded entire military campaigns. Exotic materials were imported from across the empire to furnish the underground chambers. Skilled craftsmen worked continuously to create new equipment and artistic works. The gladiators themselves required specialized feeding, training, and medical care that far exceeded normal maintenance costs. But Caligula viewed these expenditures as investments in imperial security rather than mere entertainment expenses. By creating a system that compromised Rome's most powerful citizens while satisfying his personal desires, he believed he was building an unshakable foundation for his reign. Every guest who participated in his private gatherings became a stakeholder in maintaining the secrecy that protected them all. The emperor's confidence in this strategy grew as he witnessed its effects on Roman politics. Senators who had once questioned his policies found themselves supporting his initiatives without explanation. Military commanders who had seemed unreliable became models of loyalty. Wealthy merchants competed to provide resources for imperial projects they didn't understand, but dared not question. This transformation of Rome's elite created a new form of government that operated through shared complicity rather than traditional authority structures. The emperor's true power lay not in his legal prerogatives or military support, but in his ability to destroy the reputations and lives of everyone who mattered in Roman society. As the system matured, it began to attract participants from beyond Rome's borders. Foreign kings and tribal leaders who visited the imperial court found themselves drawn into gatherings that cemented their subordination to Roman authority through means that treaties and military threats had never achieved. These diplomatic victories came at costs that were never recorded in official histories, but that fundamentally altered the character of Roman imperial relationships. The gladiators who served as the foundation for this entire system found themselves occupying a position in Roman society that had never existed before. They were simultaneously the most degraded and the most powerful people in the empire. Property whose value exceeded that of free citizens, slaves whose influence reached into the highest levels of government. This paradoxical existence created psychological fractures that ran deeper than any wound they might receive in the arena. These men lived in constant awareness that their bodies were not their own, yet they wielded influence over senators and generals through their intimate knowledge of imperial secrets. They understood that a whispered word to the emperor could elevate or destroy the most powerful families in Rome, yet they themselves could be discarded without a moment's notice if their services were no longer required. The daily routine for these selected gladiators bore little resemblance to traditional training regimens. Their mornings began before dawn with elaborate purification rituals that prepared them for potential imperial summons. Specialized servants would apply oils that had been infused with rare spices, arrange their hair according to the emperor's current preferences, and inspect their bodies for any blemishes that might displease their master. The preparation chambers where these rituals took place had been transformed into spaces that combined the functionality of a bathhouse with the luxury of a palace. Marble surfaces were heated to precise temperatures, while attendants manipulated their bodies with the skill of trained masseurs and the clinical efficiency of military surgeons preparing warriors for battle. But the most disturbing aspect of their daily preparation wasn't physical, it was the systematic conditioning that ensured their complete psychological compliance. Each morning brought exercises designed to reinforce their subordination, subtle reminders of their powerlessness, and rewards for demonstrations of appropriate enthusiasm for their expanded duties. The gladiators learned to compete among themselves for imperial attention in ways that would have horrified their former selves. Where once they had fought for glory in the arena, now they vied for notice in chambers where their worth was measured by entirely different criteria. The warriors' code that had once governed their behavior was replaced by new rules that prioritized submission, availability, and the ability to anticipate desires that were never explicitly stated. Caligula's growing confidence in his system led him to expand its scope in ways that pushed the boundaries of even Roman excess. He began commissioning elaborate theatrical productions that combined gladiatorial combat with scenarios designed to satisfy his most specific fantasies. These performances required months of preparation and involved dozens of participants who had to be trained not just in their individual roles, but in complex choreographed sequences that told stories no Roman playwright would ever have imagined. The underground chambers were modified once again to accommodate these productions, with new stage machinery that could transform spaces instantly and create effects that seemed almost magical to participants and observers. Hidden mechanisms raised platforms from beneath the floor, while concealed operators manipulated lighting and sound to create immersive environments that supported whatever narrative the emperor desired. These theatrical events became the centerpiece of Caligula's entertainment system, drawing audiences that included not just Roman elites, but foreign dignitaries who left Rome with stories that would influence their relationships with the empire for generations. The performances were carefully designed to demonstrate Roman power in ways that traditional military displays could never achieve, showing visitors that the emperor commanded not just armies and treasures, but human beings who would perform any act at his command. The gladiators who participated in these productions found themselves learning skills that had nothing to do with combat: acting techniques, musical performance, and forms of dance that emphasized grace and sensuality over martial prowess. Some discovered unexpected talents in these areas and began to take pride in their artistic abilities, even as they understood the degrading context in which these skills were employed. But for others, the expansion of their duties into theatrical performance represented a final breaking point. Warriors who had found ways to psychologically survive their intimate service to the emperor could not reconcile themselves to becoming entertainers in elaborate fantasies that mocked everything they had once believed about honor and dignity. The emperor's response to resistance or reluctance was characteristically swift and brutal. Gladiators who showed insufficient enthusiasm for their expanded roles were subjected to punishments that were designed not just to inflict pain, but to serve as examples for others. These disciplinary measures took place in full view of the gladiatorial community, ensuring that everyone understood the consequences of failing to meet imperial expectations. The punishments themselves were carefully calibrated to maximize psychological impact while preserving the physical attributes that made these men valuable. Rather than simply executing resistant gladiators, Caligula developed creative forms of discipline that left his victims alive but fundamentally changed. Some were subjected to procedures that altered their appearance permanently, while others faced psychological tortures that broke their spirits without damaging their bodies. The most effective punishment, however, was the threat of being returned to normal gladiatorial service. Men who had lived for months or years in the luxury of imperial favor found the prospect of returning to standard barracks conditions almost unbearable. They had become accustomed to fine foods, comfortable quarters, and the relative safety of knowing their value to the emperor protected them from casual violence. This psychological dependence became Caligula's most powerful tool for maintaining control over his private army of entertainers. The gladiators policed themselves, reporting any signs of discontent or resistance among their fellows out of fear that group punishment might cost them their privileged status. The emperor had successfully created a system where his victims became active participants in their own oppression. The broader impact of this system on Roman society was profound and largely hidden from public view. The traditional moral boundaries that had governed elite behavior for centuries began to erode as more and more powerful families found themselves compromised by their participation in imperial entertainments. What had once been unthinkable became merely private, while activities that would have destroyed reputations in previous generations were now simply matters to be kept quiet. The emperor's ability to command absolute discretion from his participants created a new form of political currency based on shared secrets rather than traditional alliances. Information about who had attended which gatherings became more valuable than military intelligence, while knowledge of specific activities could be used to influence policy decisions and political appointments. This shadow economy of compromise and blackmail operated parallel to Rome's official governmental structures, creating invisible networks of influence that shaped imperial policy in ways that would never appear in official records. Senators voted according to considerations that had nothing to do with their stated principles, while military commanders made strategic decisions influenced by their desire to protect secrets that could destroy their careers. The gladiators at the center of this system began to understand their unique position and occasionally attempted to leverage their knowledge for personal advantage. Those who had gained the emperor's particular favor sometimes requested privileges or protections for family members, using their intimate access to imperial power in ways that traditional slaves could never have imagined. But such attempts at manipulation were dangerous games that required extraordinary skill and careful timing. Caligula was always suspicious of his gladiators' motives and quick to punish any perceived attempt to exploit their position. The emperor's paranoia about potential betrayal led him to constantly test his gladiators' loyalty through scenarios designed to reveal any hidden agenda or divided allegiance. These loyalty tests often took the form of orders that forced gladiators to choose between their own interests and their duty to the emperor. A man might be ordered to participate in activities involving family members or former friends, with his response carefully monitored for signs of hesitation or emotional conflict. Those who passed these tests earned greater trust and access, while those who failed faced immediate punishment and possible elimination. The psychological pressure of living under constant evaluation, while maintaining perfect performance in increasingly demanding roles, began to take its toll on even the strongest gladiators. Many developed nervous conditions that manifested in tremors, sleeplessness, and digestive problems that no amount of luxury could cure. Others began showing signs of what we might now recognize as dissociative disorders, creating alternate personalities that could handle their imperial duties while protecting their core identity from complete destruction. The emperor seemed to view these psychological casualties with the same clinical interest he applied to physical injuries sustained in arena combat. He would discuss his gladiators' mental states with court physicians, seeking ways to maintain their usefulness while managing the side effects of their expanded service. Some were given medications designed to calm their nerves or improve their performance, while others received treatments that were essentially early forms of psychological manipulation. The most successful gladiators in this environment were those who managed to find ways to take genuine pleasure in their service, transforming their psychological survival mechanism into something approaching authentic enjoyment. These men became Caligula's favorites, earning positions of influence within the gladiatorial hierarchy that came with real power over their fellow fighters. But even success in this system came with its own form of imprisonment. The gladiators who rose to positions of favor found themselves increasingly isolated from normal human relationships, surrounded by luxury but cut off from any authentic emotional connections. Their fellow gladiators viewed them with a mixture of envy and suspicion, while their elevated status made them targets for the emperor's paranoia about potential rivals or threats. The architectural modifications to support this expanding system had transformed entire sections of the underground complex into a hidden city that operated according to its own rules and rhythms. New chambers were constantly under construction, each designed for specific purposes that pushed the boundaries of Roman engineering and craftsmanship. Skilled artisans worked in complete secrecy to create spaces that combined functionality with artistic beauty in ways that served the emperor's vision of perfect entertainment. These craftsmen became prisoners of their own expertise, too valuable to be released, but too knowledgeable to be allowed freedom of movement or communication with the outside world. The hidden city beneath Rome grew to include workshops where specialized equipment was manufactured, storage areas for the elaborate costumes and props required for theatrical productions, and living quarters for the hundreds of people required to maintain the emperor's private entertainment system. This underground world operated with the efficiency of a military installation while maintaining the luxury standards of an imperial palace. The logistical challenges of supplying this hidden community were immense, requiring discrete supply chains that could provide exotic foods, rare materials, and specialized services without attracting unwanted attention from curious Romans. Trusted merchants found themselves drawn into networks of suppliers who never fully understood what they were providing or where their goods were ultimately used. The financial costs of maintaining this elaborate system continued to escalate as Caligula's demands became more sophisticated and his audience expectations grew higher. Entire provinces were taxed to fund entertainments that their taxpayers could never have imagined, while treasury officials struggled to hide the true destination of funds that officially supported public works and military expenses. But the emperor viewed these expenditures as investments in imperial security that would pay dividends for generations. By creating a system that bound Rome's elite together through shared complicity while satisfying his personal desires, he believed he had solved the fundamental problems of imperial governance that had plagued his predecessors. The gladiators who formed the foundation of this system had become something entirely new in human history, a class of people who existed simultaneously as property and power brokers, victims and influencers, objects of desire and agents of imperial will. Their unique position in Roman society created possibilities and dangers that none of them could have anticipated when they first entered the arena as simple fighters seeking glory and freedom. The psychological transformation required to function in this role had created personalities that were fundamentally different from either traditional slaves or free citizens. These men had learned to navigate complex social and political situations while maintaining the physical conditioning and combat skills that had originally defined their value. Their influence extended far beyond the underground chambers where they performed their primary duties. Through their intimate knowledge of imperial secrets and their understanding of the powerful Romans who participated in these gatherings, they had become informal intelligence networks that could shape policy decisions and political outcomes in ways that would never appear in official records. As Caligula's confidence in his system grew, he began to envision even grander applications for his gladiatorial entertainments. The emperor dreamed of events that would demonstrate Roman power to the entire known world, spectacular productions that would cement his legacy as the greatest ruler in human history, while satisfying appetites that continued to evolve and expand with each successful gathering. The ultimate expression of Caligula's vision came in the winter of 40 AD when he announced plans for what he called the Great Games, a week-long celebration that would combine traditional gladiatorial combat with private entertainments on a scale never before attempted. The emperor had grown tired of intimate gatherings limited to a few dozen participants. He wanted to create spectacles that would involve hundreds of gladiators and guests in coordinated performances that would push the boundaries of human endurance and imagination. The preparations for these great games required the construction of entirely new facilities beneath Rome. Engineers working under conditions of absolute secrecy excavated chambers that dwarfed the existing underground complex, creating spaces large enough to accommodate elaborate set pieces and hundreds of participants simultaneously. The construction required the removal of thousands of tons of earth and stone, all of which had to be disposed of without attracting attention from curious Romans who might wonder about the mysterious excavation taking place beneath their feet. The selected gladiators found themselves subjected to training regimens that made their previous conditioning seem gentle by comparison. They were required to master not just individual skills, but complex choreographed sequences that involved dozens of participants working in perfect coordination. The slightest mistake during these rehearsals resulted in punishment that served as motivation for everyone involved to achieve the precision the emperor demanded. But as the preparations intensified, cracks began to appear in the system that Caligula had spent years perfecting. The sheer scale of the planned entertainments required involving more people than ever before, creating security risks that even the emperor's paranoia couldn't fully control. Servants who had maintained perfect discretion when managing smaller gatherings found themselves overwhelmed by the logistics of coordinating massive productions. More dangerously, some of the gladiators who had seemed completely broken by their conditioning began to show signs of resistance as they understood the full scope of what would be required of them during the great games. Years of psychological manipulation had created men who could endure almost any individual demand, but the prospect of participating in week-long spectacles involving hundreds of people pushed some beyond their breaking point. The first serious rebellion occurred during a rehearsal for one of the planned productions. A gladiator named Lucius, who had served the emperor faithfully for over 2 years, suddenly refused to continue participating in a scenario that involved activities he could no longer force himself to perform. His breakdown was so complete and public that it inspired others to question their own compliance with imperial demands. Caligula's response was swift and characteristically brutal. Lucius was subjected to punishments that were designed not just to destroy him, but to serve as an example that would terrorize the other gladiators into perfect obedience. The emperor ordered that the rebels' suffering be prolonged over several days, with each torture session conducted in full view of the gladiatorial community. But the example that was supposed to restore order instead had the opposite effect. Witnessing their former companion's agony reminded the other gladiators of their own humanity in ways that years of conditioning had failed to suppress. Small acts of defiance began to appear, subtle refusals to follow orders, deliberate mistakes during training, and whispered conversations that violated the emperor's demands for absolute silence. The underground community that had once operated with military precision began to show signs of instability that worried even Caligula's most trusted administrators. Reports reached the emperor of gladiators who had attempted to harm themselves rather than participate in upcoming entertainments, while others had begun showing symptoms of mental breakdown that made them unsuitable for public presentation. The emperor's solution was to accelerate the timeline for the Great Games, believing that the spectacle itself would restore order by demonstrating his absolute power over everyone involved. But the rushed preparations created additional problems as exhausted gladiators and overwhelmed staff made mistakes that would have been unthinkable during the carefully managed smaller gatherings. Meanwhile, the broader Roman political situation was deteriorating as senators and other elites began to understand that their participation in the emperor's private entertainments had created a form of slavery more complete than anything experienced by traditional bondsmen. They had traded their dignity and freedom for temporary safety, only to discover that the emperor's demands continued to escalate without limit. A conspiracy began to form among those who had been most deeply compromised by their participation in imperial entertainments. These men understood that their only hope of escape lay in removing the emperor himself, but they also knew that Caligula's knowledge of their secrets gave him leverage that would survive even his death if proper precautions weren't taken. The gladiators at the center of the system found themselves in an impossible position as they became aware of the brewing political crisis. Some saw an opportunity to gain freedom by allying themselves with the emperor's enemies, while others feared that any change in government would result in their elimination as inconvenient witnesses to imperial crimes. The most psychologically damaged gladiators had become so dependent on the structure of their servitude that they actively opposed any threat to the system that had defined their existence for years. These men served as the emperor's most reliable informants, reporting on conversations and activities that might indicate disloyalty among their fellow fighters. But even Caligula's most faithful gladiators were beginning to show signs of strain, as they understood that the Great Games would likely represent a form of mass suicide for everyone involved. The emperor's vision had grown so grandiose and demanding that survival seemed impossible for participants who had already been pushed to the limits of human endurance. The financial cost of the planned spectacles had reached levels that threatened the stability of the imperial treasury. Provinces that had already been taxed beyond their capacity to pay were being asked to provide additional resources for entertainments, whose true purpose could never be explained to the taxpayers who funded them. Military commanders who had once supported the emperor's policies began to express concern about the resources being diverted from essential defense needs to support private entertainments that served no strategic purpose. These concerns were carefully expressed in language that avoided direct criticism of imperial priorities, but the underlying message was clear to anyone who understood the political situation. The tension between the emperor's private obsessions and his public responsibilities had reached a breaking point that even his most skilled administrators could no longer manage. The system that had once seemed to offer perfect control over Rome's elite had become a source of instability that threatened the foundations of imperial government. As word of the planned Great Games spread through Rome's underground networks, stories began to emerge about the true nature of the entertainments that had been taking place beneath the city for years. These rumors, carefully spread by political enemies of the emperor, created a climate of disgust and fear among ordinary Romans, who had once celebrated their young ruler's ascension to power. The gladiators who had survived years of service in the emperor's private entertainment system found themselves at the center of a political storm that would determine not just their own fate, but the future of the Roman Empire itself. Some would choose to stand with the emperor who had defined their existence, while others would seek redemption through alliance with his enemies. But for most, the choice was already made by years of conditioning that had left them unable to imagine any existence outside the system that had consumed their lives. They would perform their assigned roles in the Great Games not because they chose to, but because they had forgotten how to choose anything else. The conspiracy against Caligula reached its climax on January 24th, 41 AD, when Cassius Chaerea and other Praetorian guards struck down the emperor in a corridor of his own palace. The assassination was swift and brutal, ending a reign that had lasted less than 4 years but had fundamentally altered the character of Roman imperial power. In the chaos that followed the emperor's death, the gladiators who had formed the foundation of his private entertainment system found themselves abandoned by the very people they had served. Some were killed by guards seeking to eliminate witnesses, while others simply disappeared into the underground chambers that had been their prison and palace. The underground complex beneath Rome was sealed and abandoned, its chambers left to decay along with the secrets they had contained. The artistic collection that had documented years of imperial entertainments was destroyed or hidden so thoroughly that future generations would struggle to believe that such things had ever existed. The gladiators who survived the purges that followed Caligula's assassination found themselves in a world that had no place for men, whose identities had been so completely shaped by service to a dead tyrant. Some managed to return to traditional gladiatorial roles, though they carried psychological scars that made normal arena combat seem almost peaceful by comparison. Others simply vanished from historical records, their fates as unknown as their true names had become during years of imperial service. They had been transformed from warriors into something else entirely, then abandoned when their creator was no longer alive to define their purpose. The new emperor, Claudius, moved quickly to distance himself from his predecessor's excesses, while quietly ensuring that the most damaging evidence of Caligula's reign would never see daylight. The sealed chambers beneath Rome became forbidden zones that were gradually forgotten as the city rebuilt itself around the memory of a ruler who had pushed the boundaries of human cruelty beyond what even Romans could tolerate. But the shadows cast by Caligula's reign extended far beyond the underground chambers, where his most private entertainments had taken place. The system he had created demonstrated possibilities for the exercise of absolute power that would haunt subsequent emperors and influence the development of imperial government for centuries to come. The gladiators who had served as unwilling architects of this system had paid the ultimate price for their master's vision of perfect control. Their stories disappeared along with their names, leaving only fragments of evidence that scholars would struggle to interpret across the vast gulf of centuries. In the end, Caligula's secret orgies represented more than just the private excesses of a mad emperor. They revealed the logical conclusion of a system that treated human beings as property while concentrating unlimited power in the hands of individuals who had been corrupted by their own authority. The gladiators who had been forced to participate in these entertainments had become symbols of humanity's capacity for both degradation and endurance. Their suffering served as a warning about the dangers of absolute power, while their survival testified to the resilience of the human spirit, even under the most impossible circumstances. Today, tourists walk above the ruins of Caligula's underground complex without knowing what lies beneath their feet. The Colosseum stands as a monument to gladiatorial courage and skill, while the chambers where that courage was systematically destroyed remain hidden in darkness. But the lessons of those hidden chambers echo through history, reminding us that civilization's greatest monuments often rest on foundations of carefully concealed suffering. The gladiators who served Caligula's twisted vision have long since turned to dust, but their story remains as a testament to both human cruelty and the enduring power of those who refuse to surrender their humanity, even in the face of absolute evil. Their voices, silenced by death and buried by shame, still whisper warnings to anyone willing to listen about the price of unchecked power and the courage required to resist it. In remembering their sacrifice, we honor not just their suffering, but our own responsibility to ensure that such systematic cruelty never again masquerades as entertainment or governance. The secret orgies of Caligula's gladiators ended with their master's death, but the questions they raise about power, humanity, and resistance remain as relevant today as they were in ancient Rome. Their story reminds us that behind every empire's grandeur lie individual human tragedies that deserve our attention and our commitment to building a world where such suffering is no longer possible.